Welcome back to the second panel session we've got here today, where we're going to be exploring what legal consumers want. Are their expectations changing? What does that mean for legal businesses? Does this mean they'll have to work differently? So we'll be looking at some of those questions. I'm delighted to be joined by our panellists for this session. Again, I'm not going to read through their biographies, which you'll have in your pack. But just to introduce, we've got Paul, who, as well as many other roles and expertise in market research, is a member of the Legal Services Consumer Panel. We have Dagmar, who co-founded the Bristol and Bath Legal Tech and also works on innovation at the West of England Combined Authority. Pierre, who founded and run startups including Law Hive, and Rachel, who works at the University of the West of England and runs a law clinic there. So again, I'm going to start with the same opening question for everybody on our panel. When it comes to choosing and using legal services, what do customers expect? So shall I start at this end?
Me,
Paul,
yes.
start with you.
I presume most of our legal colleagues are familiar with the Legal Services Consumer Panel, but for perhaps some of our technology colleagues who are not, we are the consumer voice, and we sit independently from, but very closely alongside the Legal Services Board. So we've all been selected to be on the panel because of our expertise in consumer things and regulation as well. So my own background is very much focused around the consumer, and also through technical people I've worked for some of all the big names in technology, so I've done a lot of things around digital innovation. And it's very interesting. I love the fact that you use those words, thank you, because we run a tracker survey every year, and it always has two aspects to it, choosing and using. So we look very closely at how that changes over time, and obviously we've looked at and measured, actually asked consumers through a proper, in-depth, independent market research, what consumers of legal services think about choosing and using. And we asked them about technology, not in as much depth as perhaps we might do going forward, given the impact of digitization. I think the thing that comes through strongly for us is that a lot of people talking about the impact of the pandemic and the acceleration of digitization that came because of that, we found that post-pandemic, if we can call it that now, people are going back to the old way of working. And there is always quite a strong preference for face-to-face contact. So our research shows us that when shopping around, so choosing to start with, about 39% sounds very precise. So about 2/5 of people do shop around, quite a lot don't. And they're primarily the primary sources of information for people that do not shop around tend to be family and friends. And there's a lot of using organisations they've done before. But those that actively shop around, about 2/5. We'd like to see that being much higher. I mean, that's part of the ambition set by the CMA. 56% of those people compare on price, and 45% on reputation. Now, we would like to see a world where people are choosing based on quality and then value for money rather than price. But some of the challenges we have is that I'm afraid to say the profession has been very slow at moving forward with transparency on price, which has been on the books for a long time, and we're still a long way from being where we'd like to be on transparency on price. Quality is still in its really in the very early stages of development. There's very little other than trying to research the reputation. And we'd like to see a lot more transparency around that, some ways of measuring quality. Clearly some of the key factors are professionalism, and there's some way of looking at that if you can look at who's been in a particular firm for how long, what level of seniority are they, where have they been trained. But we'd like to see transparency around things like customer service quality indicators, volumes of complaints, as well as I think even more importantly, positive feedback from consumers. So in terms of actually using services, as I say, there was quite a big shift to use of video conferencing, etc., during the pandemic. But this preference, it's in excess of 2/3. This strong preference for access to face-to-face still sits there at 68%. And just to give you an idea, the use of sort of face-to-face pre-pandemic was 43% of people using legal services. It went down to 36, and it's back up to 43. So it's almost gone back to the same level. So I think it made people familiar with the use of digital services, but there are still some barriers there, and perhaps I can come and talk about that later as we get further into the discussion. But that's really illustrating what our job is to try and get the evidence that tells us where consumers are in terms of using legal services, and relevant to this conference, the use of digital services.
Thank you. Dagmar, to you next.
Okay, so with my public servant hat on, I'm particularly interested in access to justice and access to law, really, and the consumers that aren't consumers of law at this moment in time. So we've got for our area, the West of England, when we are looking at the Law Society's data on legal aid and the legal aid deserts, they are particularly pronounced around Bristol, Bath and South Gloucestershire, which is our area. And if you overlay them with the deprivation data that we've got, it's almost a direct match. So we clearly have potential consumers of legal services who are not being served at all. And that is largely down to cost. And transparency, of course, would definitely help, but it only helps if you've got some funds in order to fund access to legal services, and also identifying your issues as a legal issue. So there's an educational element in the whole thing, and an outreach element, because a lot of our residents do not identify their issues as potentially legal issues. So that's the first barrier really there. And if you then overlay it with digital and digital inclusion issues that we most definitely have, and that is both in terms of broadband and mobile connectivity, that isn't covering our whole area properly and equally. And again, if you look at deprivation data at the same time, you will find the same thing, that digital connectivity often is particularly poor in deprived areas and rural areas, that is. And then that's the hardware, that's the actual connectivity. But then can you access that digital connectivity even if it is outside your door? So can you afford the data? Do you have the hardware to access it? Do you have laptops, PCs, mobile phones, etc.? So from my West of England Combined Authority perspective, there is a whole bunch of people out there who don't know they need you, and that can't access you on a number of matters. So that's really worrying, I feel. And I know that the Law Society and the SRA are aware of that, and certainly provide data around that, which is really good. It's a really good start for us to get data in order to work out what to do next. When I think about consumers, businesses as consumers, because that is what for BBLT and for business support from the West of England Combined Authority, we concern ourselves with. So businesses looking for legal services. I would say what they're looking for is that you fit seamlessly into what they're already doing. So if they're digitally literate, digitally advanced, then they will definitely expect law firms and legal services to be provided at their level. And that can be quite a basic level. That can be the level of where your staff and your fee earners can demonstrate that they're on top of very basic digital skills. So they can deal with the spreadsheet, they can analyze data you are sending over to them. So it's that kind of basic level that they're potentially looking for, not necessarily the massive legal innovation. Especially when we're talking SMEs. They just want somebody at the other end who can connect with their data, with their spreadsheet, and talk business to them in digital terms.
Thank you. Pierre, over to you next.
So, I mean, to give a bit of context, I guess from our perspective, we operate an online platform that allows any independent, self-employed solicitor in the country to work with any client in the country. And so, you know, from the consumer side, we see tens of thousands of consumers coming to our site every month, all looking for digital delivery of legal services. And that's driven, I mean, nothing really has changed historically by the C's cost and convenience. It's just that cost and convenience, whereas formerly meant you go up the high street to your local, you know, law firm, small office, you knock on the door, you go through the door and you sit down and you wait. Now it's instant, it's readily available, and the bar has changed considerably for consumer purchasing habits, behaviors, user experience. And the expectation from a consumer user now is that of instant, you know, a lot of thoughtfulness around user experience, something that an offline experience just cannot provide. So, you know, we think about it from being a platform, we think about it from the flip side of that, you know, if you want to solve problems in terms of accessibility, access to the law, which we're very focused on from a mission point of view, you have to look at actually the flip side, the solicitor, the lawyer market in the UK, and how lawyers are operating, how they work. So we're very focused on transforming how lawyers practice their craft and you know, carry out the things that they're passionate about, which, as it turns out, is being lawyers and practicing the law. And so if we can remove through our platform all of the other gumph that lawyers end up having to do, then they're freed up to just focus on what they're passionate about. That also happens to remove the 38% of overhead, non-salaried overhead costs that small firms themselves have to pay for. And as a result, therefore, has a transformative effect on pricing. As Dagmar says, it's one thing to have transparency, but you need low cost, ultimately, to increase access. Beyond, you know, obviously, legal aid does an awesome job in certain segments of the market, but it doesn't cover the whole market. So for us, that starts with how do you change the way, you know, independent lawyers act as self-employed lawyers throughout the country. And then from there, that has this sort of, you know, almost magical, although not really, very, very logical transformative effect on accessibility on the consumer side of things.
Thank you very much. And Rachel?
I'm going to build on what Dagmar said. So I'm wearing two hats. In a sense, I'm wearing the hat of legal education, which we'll perhaps come back to. But for this question, I'm wearing the hat of somebody who's involved in running a law clinic. And the experience I draw on is from working with clients who come to us day to day for help in family law, employment law, consumer and contract matters, but also two projects that I've been, well, two linked projects. One is the SRA funded Pioneer Fund project, which looked at access to justice in legal tech, which Dagmar was also involved in. And the spin-off out of that was a much smaller project where we did a little bit of work with a lived experience group who've experienced, in particular, financial abuse through a charity in Bath, and their lived experience of what they needed in terms of legal support. And for me, the question, in a sense, the type of clients I'm talking about don't expect, because they fight to get help. So what do they need, I think, is more the question. And two things: they need help that is accessible, and they also need help that's empowering. So they need to identify they've got a legal issue in the first place, and that point's already been picked up. And this was something that certainly came out of the experience of the women who'd gone through financial abuse. It took them a very long time to realise there was even a legal issue going on, and often all these legal issues overlap each other. So diagnosing is one thing, to even know what kind of help you need. You need access to knowledge about that. You need help to access processes. Now, obviously, a lot of the processes through the court, for example, you know, from my end of what I'm looking at, things like making application for an unfair dismissal claim, bringing a small claim and so on, there is an element of technology involved in that. But clients still struggle to actually understand. The language does not necessarily speak to the client. It's not always based on the user experience or fully based on the user experience. So clients still need help to navigate and understand what it is they're being asked to do. You know, when they get a notice of allocation from the court of their case to the small claims track, what the hell is that? What does that mean? There is a lot of information online the citizens' advice and all the rest of it, brilliant. But the thing that clients say is we don't know how to sift and organise that. We don't have the skill set for that. They then need to navigate the processes themselves and know what it is they're expected to do. So where a lawyer would have stepped in and prepared a case, people need to do these things for themselves. And now I'm going to flip it over and say that we're talking, and marvellous kind of work and approaches in joining up people with lawyers, but legal aid isn't coming back. And I think this event, in a way, is helping me shift my own mindset to, rather than thinking, how do we replicate or how do we get people in front of lawyers, what are the systems that these people can do to empower themselves? And that's the way it's got to go. And I think that comes out of what Dan Wright said in the first session. Commercial clients and somebody on the ground who's experienced a housing issue, what have you, in a sense, they both probably want that. They don't want to be feeling beholden to lawyers they cannot afford. In the case of the types of client we're talking about, it's not realistic. They need to be able to navigate these processes themselves. So what can technology do to actually support them through the process? And I'll give one example of a company who I think are working in that direction, and there may be other people here who I've not spoken to today, but Vala, a group of women working in legal tech, suffered discrimination, have now set up a company, and I don't know what the latest news is from them, but providing software which enables somebody who needs to put themselves through a discrimination claim, which is really complex to do, as you will know, to actually gather their timeline, draft their documents and all of that kind of thing. That person doesn't need full understanding of the law, but they can do enough through using the software platforms, and they can pay for a bit of it or they can use some of it free, to actually put themselves in a sensible shape before a tribunal. The other point I want to make is that isn't going to be enough in itself, and there still needs to be within the system, a combination of the tech that can help in that space, but also advocacy. So rather than lawyers doing the things that are really expensive in terms of preparing cases and what have you, they need to be there, I think, as a guiding hand and a reassurance, and obviously to do the advocacy if that's what's required in the case that's involved. Certainly the experience of the women who'd lived through domestic and other forms of abuse was going through the court process was more traumatising in some instances than actually experiencing the abuse in the first place. The best tech in the world isn't going to get them through that. So the human resources need to be focused on that aspect of it as much as possible. And just a plea, and I'll probably come back to this theme at the end again, is that this sector needs not to be left behind. And so that when there is investment in commercial solutions for all sorts of problems that are in the, in the commercial space, can some of that please trickle down, and can firms and organisations with a bit of resource be thinking how they might apply that down to support the access to justice agenda? So that's a little bit of soapbox. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, and you're perfectly entitled to your soapbox moment. I think that's absolutely fine. So very interesting and some kind of diverse perspectives there. I was just going to give you the answers to our Slido poll now. So we asked about, are consumers driving a greater use of technology and legal services? 95% of you said yes. 5% said no. So that's quite interesting. A pretty significant majority said yes. I just wanted to come out now, if I could, to the audience and see if anybody will tell us why they voted the way they did, what they're seeing. Perhaps one of you somebody said, thank you very much. Here we go.
Hate a quiet room, so I thought I'd chip in. So I can probably speak fairly objectively, actually, because I used to sell legal services to law firms and corporations, and also there was a couple of different elements to that. And actually one of the biggest drivers was actually corporations and the companies and the individuals who'd actually be using the law firms started to say, okay, well, why aren't we using this ourselves? Is it cheaper? Actually, there's a lot of what these firms are doing that we can actually cut costs on, and actually it's safer if we use it ourselves in terms of data. So I think it was definitely driven by the clients in a lot of areas, and actually if firms weren't stepping up to that mark, clients were going out there and getting it themselves, whether they were individuals or large corporations. So I think there definitely is a drive there.
Very interesting, and kind of comes to what you said, Dagmar, about just clients and businesses wanting their law firms to sort of have a kind of common language or a common sort of way of, a common understanding, even if it's some of the basics, but at least to have that kind of common
of the
common
basics, but also being in Bristol, of course, we are a leading tech cluster in the UK, so we have a thriving startup and scale-up community out there in all sorts of tech areas. That goes from creative tech to deep tech, health tech, you name it, but there's certain clusters, so it's not quite agri-tech maybe. But those firms and I do mix regularly in those clusters, and they've got almost comparable barriers to obtaining legal services, as I've just mentioned, in respect of deprived areas and deprived communities, in the sense that they find it difficult to identify whether they've got a legal issue or not. And also they are entirely flabbergasted when they are first confronted with how legal services are delivered in terms of transparency of price, packaged up product rather than service maybe. So they're used to that in their own journey, growing their business, and they cannot understand why lawyers seem to be lagging behind in the way they deliver their services and their products. And there's a whole untapped market, certainly in Bristol and Bath, for lawyers in the startup and scale-up industries, where with a bit of education and also packaging up legal services and digitalizing yourself would open up whole new markets to small law firms who specialize in that area. And why that not? We've got a few people mixing from different law firms in those cluster activities, and they're very social clusters, of course, because they're startups. So it's easy to find them, and it's easy. You've got ready-made client meetings there, really, where you could be out and finding people to work for, and that is not really happening at the very small startup market, which is something that I'm surprised by, that the SME legal services aren't out there doing exactly that.
Anybody else want to pipe up from the audience around what you thought on this question and how you voted? Anyone who said they thought that customers' expectations weren't driving tech, prepared to, one of the 5% prepared to out yourself? No, you can just sit quietly on that. Maybe you'll change your mind after this panel. I don't know, or maybe not. So I just want to come back to you, Pierre, if I can, in terms of your model. I just wondered what your view was on whether you think it matters to the consumer how aware their solicitor works, and for example, whether they're based in a traditional office or not, online, in person. Be interested in your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously slightly biased in that we're an online platform, so the delivery model is focused on the section of society in the UK that sees the value in digital user experience in a digital product, and the immediacy of that. When people have a legal problem, that is usually also connected to something that's emotional. It's usually high priority for them in their lives. It's a sort of inflection point for them, and so being able to get help quickly in the method of their choosing from their own home is a very powerful thing. Something that I mentioned earlier is I think expectations have changed around consumer behavior, and even something as traditional historically as banking has changed dramatically. I don't know how many people in the room have on their phone a digital only bank, Starling, Monzo, Revolut. Put your hands up if you have one. There we go. So 38% of the UK market has a digital-only bank. 25% only uses that bank. So consumer habits have changed drastically from 5-10 years ago. Obviously, that's an industry, banking, that's had to solve all kinds of compliance and security issues in being able to offer those accounts. Something that we're still on a journey in this industry to solve. So for us, it's been about sort of bringing those same mental models, that sort of first principles thinking around how do we solve issues of compliance, of data protection, security, of secure comms between client and solicitor, and so forth, in a way that then practitioners, lawyers don't have to think about, because from our point of view, obviously again we're a bit biased because we're providing this, but lawyers don't want to have to think about all of these sort of aspects of sort of effectively admin and solving problems. They want to get on and practice the law. So I think on the consumer side, really as behaviors change, I think that will drive a lot of change in the industry automatically. We use, there was a lot of talk of artificial intelligence. We use artificial intelligence to automate a lot of manual process, particularly in the client onboarding stage, legal assessment stage. A lot of solicitors that come to us are spending 45 minutes to an hour just setting up a file on a new client. That for us is a 2 to 3 minute task. So if we can remove a lot of that sort of legacy practice that firms and solicitors are undertaking, then that dramatically transforms the landscape for the solicitor, but also therefore the consumer side of things. So I think from the consumer, they don't care whether they're going to someone's office. Actually, a lot of them don't want to. And we had a really interesting thing happen through COVID, that we saw a lot of people coming to our platform seeking name changes. And we're wondering sort of, just from the standpoint of learnings, why they were, so many people coming for name changes. Turned out a lot of people were going through the gender transformation or gender reassignment, and they wanted to change their names and were not comfortable going to a physical local law firm to go and sit down and explain why they were changing their names, have to sort of meet someone in person and effectively be interviewed, so to speak. And they preferred the delivery model of online. It was instant. They're able to get done what they want to do. That was, again, going back to this point, it was a really important emotional part of their lives. So we were really pleased to have been a part of that and be able to serve that. So I think there's many, many more examples that we've seen in terms of where the online delivery model is just vastly preferential from consumer behavior, consumer point of view.
That's very interesting, and it chimes with what we heard this morning, Alan saying about some of the questions that that people were very happy to answer through a digital journey, and in fact actually might have found harder to answer in a preliminary interview face to face with a lawyer. So certainly we've heard that. Paul, I wanted to kind of come back to you on that point. You talked a little bit about the changing trends in terms of how consumers are interacting with law firms and what the tracker survey was showing. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that, and also you made the point earlier about face-to-face interactions and some of the sort of some of the barriers there, and I wondered if you might want to comment on that.
Yes, certainly. I mean, in terms of I'll start with the last point first, because I think it's very illustrative that the trends in terms of how technology is influencing consumer behaviour, I think are fairly weak. I mean, I think the SRA surveyed solicitors, and it was a sort of figure of something like 80-something% had used video conferencing. But as I said earlier, the shift back to that strong preference for face-to-face interaction, post-pandemic, almost is saying that, well, yes, 2/3 of consumers say they're fairly comfortable with, a hybrid approach, so digital, but they definitely want that face-to-face, and 68%, it's more than 2/3 who want that. So I think the trends in terms of moving towards a more hybrid model are moving slowly, frankly, very slowly. And I think the reasons, and I should point out that the consumers that we're surveying actually represent a fairly small minority of the people that need legal support. I mean, from what Dagmar was saying, one of the areas that we want to explore and then look at the trends in that are the people that suffer in silence, the people that would like legal support, the many people that don't know they would like to have it because they don't know that they should be using it or could be entitled to it. And we struggle with the sort of deserts of advice and the impact, the reduction in legal aid. So that paints, I think, a fairly sort of gloomy picture if you really want to see tech as an exciting enabler of improving service for consumers. Perhaps, if I may just take it in a slightly different way, And that's based on my own experience. I've spent a lot of time helping governments and large commercial organisations understand the potential of digital. And I've seen small examples that could produce trends that would dramatically impact, I think, the adoption of technology where it can be used. And one very good example is I did a lot of work with the DWP on customer interaction for them. And I think technology has the opportunity to make things a lot easier for people who may not be technologically literate, that sit on the other side of the digital divide, but can make things a lot easier. And there are two ways that can be done. One is, artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., can make the interaction itself easier once they get access to digital tools, PCs, mobile phones, etc. But some other very interesting initiatives I saw as I travelled around talking to different governments around this issue. In Norway, they started to equip families who were not digitally enabled with their own sort of laptops at home and train families how to use them. So this was, the people that sat very much on the other, the far distant side of the digital divide. The rationale for doing it was there was a fantastic business case for the taxpayer because the cost of interaction with those families went down dramatically. So the agencies could provide better services more quickly, more accurately, at lower cost by giving away digital tools, laptops, mobile phones, etc. So I think one way of thinking about how do we stimulate the trends rather than this sort of fairly slow, feeling slightly lackluster adoption of technology by consumers of legal services, perhaps we should think in a different way, which is how can we accelerate that given that there's this vast demand out there, this vast need of people who are underserved because they're digitally disenfranchised, or because they do not know that they are entitled to help, and that help could produce very positive outcomes from them. So really, picking up, I think, on Rachel's point, that education is absolutely key. And one thing that digital can be great at is educating people, because it's taught us all how to shop online. It's taught those of us who are slightly more privileged how to bank online. But so I almost turned the trends argument into something. Let's look for opportunities to drive those trends, and in particular for ways that add most value to those with the greatest need.
So thinking about, as you say, how we might be able to accelerate that, and as consumers in other areas, we all become sort of more and more able to use online services and to do things online. Where do we think we are in terms of the legal sector? Where do we think we are in terms of online services in the legal sector? I don't know if any of the panelists want to answer that first, but I'd also open this out to the audience as well.
I was about to say that the consumer champion, let the consumers, as you are, speak first. But I'll just offer a quick point of view. I think there are pockets of extremely impressive innovation. I know one organisation that's using the latest chatbots to help people access the social services they're entitled to. So they're an intermediary helping people get the benefits they deserve and are entitled to from the DWP. And my goodness, there's an area of fantastic. And they're using the latest technology, and they're doing it with very buzzy, exciting, sparky, startup type people. But there's that spark of digital innovation with the heart of a social conscience combined. Mm-hmm. If I could see that multiplied by 1,000, the world would be a much better place. So, a soapbox moment for you to respond.
I used to work for Starling Bank, but I've spent the majority of my last decade in law. So it's fascinating to see the difference between what is clearly possible already, and not in a bad way, not a criticism, but just lots of experience in law. We talk about a lot. We really should be doing this, and it was already there. We should be doing it now. It should already be happening. Picking on the point of facial recognition, in Starling for a bank account, you have automated facial recognition, which takes, you know, millions of applications or thousands of applications in seconds. And, you know, like Pierre's point, I'm sat in a law firm where we take about 3 hours to onboard a client. And, you know, part of that is who are you? And that, you know, that can all be automated. So it's just really interesting, I suppose, to share the differences between other sectors and our own in terms of the opportunities for innovation are definitely there.
Fantastic, thank you. No, don't worry, here's a microphone coming to you.
Just picking up on that point, really, I've been speaking to in-house teams, so insurers, for example. So you've got defendant teams with amazing innovation. Admiral Law, does fantastic work. So if you've got consumers interacting with insurers, they're still in a legal process and they're having a much different experience to, we're not necessarily comparing it to the claimant side, but even just conveyancing, home buying, divorce processes. So, it's already happening technically within legal, but actually, on the face of it, it's with an insurer. So their expectations are definitely there. Certainly for myself, my own experience, I would say, that's the kind of service that you would want, and the speed of it and the ease, and we're all very busy. So going back to your survey, I suspect that's probably why, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely, and that idea that it's really kind of cutting down on the sort of wasted time that you could be spending doing lawyering, or giving the kind of the face-to-face customer interaction
more, which is the normal tech solution, but that's fine, isn't it? Because actually you're being more creative, going back to what the other panel was saying, and if for those that need that face-to-face advisory consultancy side of legal services, where there's an option to charge more or put on a retainer, it's just grabbing those opportunities again, isn't it?
Yeah. And to the point that was made earlier by Trish in the panel earlier, I just wondered, if I could do a hands up for how many people do communicate with clients via WhatsApp, for example. So quite a significant number. And how many are using web chat or those kind of ways of talking to clients? So fewer. We've still got some people in the room. Thank you. No, I mean that's very interesting. And can I, another kind of question that I would just put out there first to the audience, and then perhaps ask if panelists want to answer. What do you think about consumer trust in legal services being provided through tech such as AI chatbots? Do you think that there is a trust issue there, that remains a barrier, or do you think that we're starting to get so much more used to seeing these things in other areas? Any thoughts?
I have thoughts, if not.
Yeah. Actually, yeah.
Go crowd first.
So I'm hogging the mic now.
No.
I think it's both, isn't it? As in, I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought now. You were talking about the trust. Yeah, I think that you'll clearly have the deep fake issue within law. This contract isn't real, but people will be duped into thinking that. So I think, online piracy, online corruption will equally, and I think your colleague summed up beautifully this morning, the risks are as inherent as the opportunities. And it would be nice if it was one thing or the other, but we're down this constant middle ground of have to cover both of those things. So I do think it'll impact trust. I certainly wouldn't want a legal contract from AI at the moment. But then I think that might change, but then with it, that also brings risk.
Yeah, interesting. Yep.
I've talked to quite a lot of firms about this in the last few months, and I think both is spot on from my experience. I think people are anticipating and getting now clients asking, "Are you using AI somewhere in your process?" And they're sometimes just trying to check that out, but also that you can't win with the answer.
Yeah.
Yes, in which case I don't want you to. Have you not read these stories? Or the answer could be no, and the client says, well, I want you to because I want you to save money and be more efficient and more automated.
Yeah.
And I suspect we're going to be in that situation for a long time.
Thank you. Alan. Oh, sorry, no, we've got, come to you in just a moment. Yeah.
Is it me?
Yes, sorry, yes, thank you.
So yeah, I work primarily with GP practices on their property work. And my experience is that it really depends on what they're coming to you for. A huge amount of what I do on a sort of day-to-day basis relates to their partner changes and work that has to be done to regulate their property. And they really don't care about it. It has to be done. They see it as an administrative thing that the bank's making them do. And so the more streamlined that can become and the easier and more automated that can become, the better. But for things that they see the value in, they definitely want that personal touch. They want someone that they can, I mean, the majority of what we do now, rather than phone calls, we do Teams calls because they like to be able to see you, to be able to talk to you. And so I think from my perspective, it really does depend hugely on what they're coming to you for and whether it's a necessity or whether it's something that they can see practical benefit from, I suppose.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Alan, yes?
I was just going to make the point that one of the applications that we're building out through our knowledge transfer partnership, the University of Brighton, 5 years in the making, we're doing some stealth testing with the public. We're very clear it's AI making the decisions on the most appropriate dispute resolution model for that couple. However, we've realised that what we're also testing is whether or not that person trusts the fact that the domain knowledge is coming from experts in that field over a very long period of time. And I've also realised that we are testing whether regulated status is a value proposition when it comes to trust. And I may have more to share on that in a couple
Well,
of weeks.
I'd be very interested when you do have more to share on that. Indeed. Here next, thank you, and then over to the back.
Yeah, in terms of AI trust, I think as one good story comes out, there's always a negative to balance it out. So I think for a very long time, it's always going to be a middle ground, because obviously with like deepfake and stuff as well, AI can do amazing things, but then it also, you know, in the wrong hands can do, you know, some pretty bad stuff as well. So I think it's always going to be a bit of a battle in terms of that kind of balance and act. So I can't see that changing anytime soon.
And as it gets incrementally more exciting, it also gets incrementally more scary, as Tom said. Thank you.
Hi, yes. I'm here from Which Legal. We advise consumers on all range of consumer issues, from low-value consumer contracts through to more complex matters. We are seeing a trend where consumers are calling us saying, I've put my query into ChatGPT and I just want to check it's right.
Yes.
Which is quite stark, but actually when thinking about it, people probably did a lot of research anyway themselves, or some did. Some people came with no idea at all what their legal rights are, and some call us, I think it's this, can I just check? So there's a trust element, I think, for using those free-to-use tools that are out there anyway. But what they can't offer is some of that practical advice and guidance that goes along with the legal advice. So a case in point is boundary disputes. People can put into ChatGPT, I've got this issue because my neighbour's put this fence here or taken down this wall, whatever. And the value they get from speaking to lawyers, you don't really want to get involved in a boundary dispute. It isn't worth it. So probably you've got to live next door to them, probably best just to leave it. Whereas ChatGPT or other tools might just say, oh yes, yeah, if it's within 6 inches, you can do this, bring this claim or whatever. So actually I think what AI can't do, even if the legal advice is right, is balance that with some pragmatic, practical advice of this is probably what you might not want to do or do in those situations. So a lot to go there, I think.
Yes. And that sort of brings us to the point that, you know, as lawyers, you're more than just a technician of the law. You know, there's a whole host of other things that you bring to the role. And I just wondered, actually, Rachel, if I could kind of ask you your view, talking about education and touching on this. What do you think about the skills required of the lawyer of the future, and you know, to what extent do you think that's going to change or need to have specialist technical knowledge, technological knowledge?
I asked ChatGPT.
Oh, did you?
Yes. And ChatGPT gave me a lovely list of all the things that tech could help me with as a lawyer.
I bet it did, yeah.
And at the end it said, but this won't replace the need for empathy, you know, the ability, the human judgment, and various other things. So I thought ChatGPT, I didn't know if ChatGPT was being entirely truthful with me about its deeper purpose, but that was interesting. I think the answer is it depends. And if you know, I'm coming from an academic environment, so I'm going to bring in some wider reading, but I don't know if people have read or hopefully people are aware of Richard Susskind's work on Tomorrow's Lawyers. Yeah, there's some nodding. There's a third edition of his book which has come out, and basically if you've not read him, he's quite scary, particularly as a legal educator. He came and absolutely scared the shit, out of a conference that I was at with legal educators, basically telling us that everything we were doing in legal education was completely out of date and we just needed to rip it all up and start again. Yes, some people are going to need specialist legal skills. I mean, the point that Richard Susskind makes very powerfully is the way that careers are changing, and I think this is what Dagmar sees in her work, that we're not just talking about lawyers here, we're talking about all the spin-off in terms of all the new businesses, the startups, the applications, the support for law, and lawyers have obviously a place to play in that, and I don't know if Dan's still with us, but I think that's, comes into his work within a law firm, but obviously without a law firm. But there's ways of breaking that down. And from a legal education perspective, we are on the absolute cusp. We're in the middle of an absolute perfect storm at the moment. We've had since the 1970s the qualifying law degree, which is based on those 7 foundational subjects. That's sort of going because of the SQE. The SQE itself is going to require our solicitors to have legal knowledge and legal skills, but doesn't really, let's be honest, address tech or any of the things that we're talking about this morning. And so in terms of building appropriate legal education, we're still going to have to deliver that, but we also are starting to think much more widely, and UWE's about to roll out a new LLB this autumn, where we're thinking much more about the holistic skill set and development of our students. And so terms like, growth mindset, design thinking and things are starting to creep into what we're doing, and then we're having to think, well, what do you want to do with the technology side itself? And I think there's a split here. Don't assume that young people are all excellent at using all forms of technology. I think that point's been made. This expression digital natives is quite misleading. Yes, they may be good at using it for their own social media and so on, but our experience of students is they shallow, they go across the top of it. They need to learn what to expect from technology, how to use it effectively. And I think this ties into the point that Dagmar made, that, what's your core tech, which isn't necessarily legal tech itself, the AI, but what are those uses that you've got for technology within your business where people could have better skills to solve problems that come up in the day-to-day. And we want our students to be good with those sorts of things. And so, for example, we work with through Clinic using a case management system, which absolutely saved our bacon when it came to we just got permission after 8 months to use it as COVID kicked in, and we couldn't have run a clinic without it because of the confidentiality and all the rest of it. So we actually went in a bit ahead of the curve there because we were actually able to kick our clinic off using tech, and a case management system's not the highest level of tech at all, but there were a lot of law clinics out there who had everything on spreadsheets, and still they weren't using technology at all. Whereas we've always been able to set up files, communicate with clients and so on in a fairly efficient way. So there's core tech, but then there's law tech, isn't there? If you think of it, the AI, the creative uses, and I think the way we're thinking around it with our own students is that we need to encourage exactly what Dan said, the curious, the creative, and the desire to take bits of risk and all that kind of thing, which are not necessarily traditional qualities in law students, who are very concerned about, difficult legal knowledge they have to master and demonstrate and so on. And so that's, I think, where we're building around. And building out those human skills, the ability to have effective relationships, the ability to collaborate, which we find is not something that law students take to naturally. They like to be lone wolves. So how do you get them to learn how to function effectively in teams, share ideas, manage projects rather than individual workloads, and those sorts of skills? And so as a baseline, I think that's where we're thinking. But for some, those more advanced technical skills are going to be really, really important. But I think that's a question for the audience, for the employers as well, who are taking people on. What are the skills and technology that you are looking for?
Has anybody changed the way in which they're recruiting? Changed the way in which they're sort of the way in which they're targeting? Thank you. Yes.
So not necessarily change the way we're recruiting, but change what we're educating our trainees on. Mm-hmm. So this year we've introduced a legal tech program where we're asking our trainees not only to understand different elements of legal tech, but then actually think about creating solutions to solve client problems, and they're targeted with different sectors within which we work, and they have to go away, understand a challenge and come back with potential solutions. So we're not asking them to come up with all the super technical answers, more about that kind of creation of ideas that are looking to solve genuine problems in a very, very practical way. And I know that Rachel and her colleagues at UE have also been looking at extending the traditional sort of skill sets. So they're looking at things like legal project management, looking at kind of legal tech to build those into the education of our future lawyers.
Very interested in, you mentioned collaboration there as being something that lawyers aren't necessarily sort of, automatically, it's not automatically part of the skill set, or students.
We find aren't, yeah.
But I just I wanted to come to you, Dagmar, on that, because I just wondered about your take on the importance of collaboration, for example, through schemes like yours, and how that can kind of, really drive innovation at a local level.
Yeah, I think collaboration is key, and this is probably my my soapbox moment. Hooray!
Everyone's got one, don't worry.
I'm a firm believer in this idea of building clusters, and that applies across industries. So legal services industry is just one of them, and we at the West of England Combined Authorities build clusters and support clusters. And the idea is that clusters have got something to offer to everybody. So that is startups, SMEs, employees, freelancers, all the way up to incumbent of that industry, and the latter are often the ones that can't quite see the point of clusters, because they look nationally, they look globally quite often, and they just happen, sometimes they feel they just happen to be in a particular area. But of course, building clusters of industries has got a whole array of evidence-based impact on that particular industry. So for example, when you think about the talent stream, if you've got a cluster, a growing cluster, they can support the right education, they can support their education providers in delivery of that education, they can influence what's next in education. So there's lots of benefits to be had in the talent stream. So for example, we are working with some law firms influencing what the next apprenticeship standard will say about technologists working in legal services delivery. That's something you can do because you're a cluster in particular, because you've got that weight to bring to bear. But there's many other benefits of industrial clusters in a region. So for example, knowledge overspill. So you exchange views, good practice, failure potentially. If you are a grown-up, you can do that. And therefore everybody can learn from that and club together. So there's knowledge overspill. You can work with universities more effectively, and FE colleges, there I mentioned them. Because they're highly relevant in this context, I would say. We don't always just need to look at universities, we need to look at that. Modular education as well, sort of lifelong learning and delivery of extra skills in adult education. So all of that you can influence and participate and share good practice on. And then of course you can also make the regional point and maybe the national point to government, and that's something I'm particularly interested in, working on research and innovation with government. For example, just awarded was the Legal Innovation Accelerator, 1.8 million. So I think, who's got it, Chris, again? Tell me again who's got it.
Oxford Brookes and Lancaster, a few others.
Yeah, so a consortium was built around a bid into that money, and they're now delivering a program of innovation acceleration, and that will benefit, of course, the UK PLC, but also the region where this is based, and the law firms and the legal education providers in that particular cluster. So when the next one comes along, I would very much like Bristol and Bath to be in the position where we can actually bid for opportunities like that. We clinched the FinTech innovation acceleration offer that came up at the same time. So we clinched it into Bristol because they're ahead of us, the FinTech cluster. And there's a lot to be learned. That's the final thing that clusters really do. They can learn from other clusters. And they do that through mixing with people like me, but also with other industries. So cross-sectoral innovation and gleaning, looking across what other people are doing. Legal isn't that special, I'm afraid. So we don't have to have legal HR and legal this and legal that. It's actually transferable, and we can learn a lot from other industries. So join Bristol and Bath Legal Tech, follow us, engage with the combined authority, and talk to each other, and don't worry about confidentiality all the time. It isn't like all pervasive. Of course it's important, but other competitive clusters do talk to each other within those clusters. If they manage, then certainly legal services can.
Thank you. So, talking about consumer expectations, Pierre, wanted to ask you a question here. I think Steve Jobs said it wasn't about giving customers what they want, rather figuring out what they're going to want before they do. I just wondered, having sort of founded successful startups and having that sort of anticipation, what advice you'd have for businesses in understanding what customers are going to need, in anticipating need in that way.
I mean, I think he was channeling Henry Ford, to build a faster horse.
That's right.
Jobs, right? And for us, I always harken back to the Y Combinator mindset of there's no substitute for getting out of the building and just going and launching something, and then talking to customers. Building and talking to customers are really the only two things that matter. I think you can sit around and debate and overthink and overtalk, and you sort of lose opportunities to learn. So for us, it's always been about sort of bias to action, and going and launching product and seeing what consumer behaviors, and trends sort of in response to that product are. On both sides, we see, our users are solicitors just as much as they are consumers. So my advice to anyone thinking about building a legal tech business or a startup of any kind is build something, launch it, get feedback, and iterate, and sort of that build, learn, iterate process is super important to any kind of innovation. I think bias to action is something that often has been tough in the legal industry insofar as compliance and regulation, but I think you guys, the SRA, are doing an awesome job in terms of our experience working with the SRA, insofar as having a progressive mindset around how does innovation play a part in the future of the legal landscape, especially around topic of this panel discussion, sort of accessibility, access to one's legal rights, all of the challenges that we as a society, or any democratic society, faces, where we find ourselves in a situation that the system of law is one of the most fundamental, crucial systems, yet it is gate-kept. It does lack access in many segments of society, and how do we solve those problems into the future? Things that, often I think the lawyer mindset is that by solving those, lawyers are going to take home less money because consumer pricing goes down, consumers have more access. But ultimately, our conclusion has been that's not the case. We see lawyers operating through our platform charging consumers a third of what they charge when they were working in a law firm or even running their own small law firm, but taking home 2 to 3 times more. So I think there are solutions out there. Obviously, we're slightly biased towards our own solution, but we would encourage greater investment in innovation, in tech, in product. AI is a piece of that, a very small piece, but it's tech and product. We talked about Starling Bank and digital banks. They don't have AI, but they would. It was an inflection point in the banking industry. I think we are at an inflection point in our industry, in the legal industry, and it's blue ocean. It's the singularly most exciting time, I think, to be in legal services in the history of the law, in the history of this industry, is right now. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for people to get out of the building, go and launch something, see what happens. It probably won't work. You'll have to do it 3-4 times over and over again. But that's the only way.
Thank you. We're nearly out of time, but just time for one last question. Thank you.
It's a comment to back that up, I think. The idea of going to lawyers, so having worked on the support side of law firms for many years, excuse me, to go to lawyers and say, what is it you want? What is the solution you want? Is probably the wrong question. It's more about what's the problem you're facing.
Yeah.
And actually, lawyers, excuse me, generalising, are very quick to come to solutions. But they're very confident in their, what I need is. But actually, to spend more time saying the problem I'm facing is a much richer conversation, and it actually then you don't go down one avenue, you have a range of avenues to explore, and then you can find out the value of each of those. So kind of focus on the problem. And it comes right back to Dan Wright's burning platform point. Unless the need is really felt, that lawyers haven't got time in their calendars to say, I think I'll just spend some time looking at this. But if they're feeling the need, then you've got a motivator.
I think that's a very powerful point to end on, so thank you very much for that. And unfortunately, we have to draw it to a close because, again, I think we could probably carry on talking for days on this topic. The insights from today, I think, have been really, really fascinating. I think there's been some real diverse views, diverse perspectives, but perhaps some key themes. Definitely some takeaways from me. One is that this conversation about innovation, the use of technology, but also all forms of innovation, it's not limited to particular areas of law. It kind of cuts across all areas from public administrative law, family law, commercial, conveyancing, and that there are opportunities and things we can think across all these different spaces. And the point about there being a sort of real world imperative, the sort of tapping into what clients need, what they want, understanding the different spaces that consumers might be in, and of course the not forgetting the silent sufferers and how actually things could be accelerated to try and reach those areas. Really important. And I think just for me the real importance of that innovation mindset and collaboration in overcoming barriers and in increasing your knowledge acquisition and being able to reach out and achieve what might not seem to be possible if you don't get out, as you say, get out of the building and build. And on that note, the sun is shining, so and you've been in this building for some time. So I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to everybody on the stage, the panel from earlier, and to the audience for taking part and your insights and your comments.